The line of English monarchs begins with Aethelstan because he conquered Northumbria in 927 CE and gained control of all England. When he died 12 years later, his half-brother Edmund I became king. Edmund was considered a good king. During his reign, Edmund helped restore Louis IV as King of France. Edmund died while attending the St. Augustine's Day Parade. There, he was killed by an exiled thief. Edmund was succeeded by his last living brother, Edred. Edred had a hard time starting out as king because two Scandinavian princes both tried to conquer his land. Edred later died of digestive malady. After Edred's death, he was succeeded by Edmund's son, Edwig. Edwig. Edwig was a very short-lived king. He only lived to be 19 years old. It was known that he had a long-standing feud with a bishop named Dunstan. According to one legend, shortly after Edwig's coronation, Dunstan found him flirting with a girl when he should have been at the meeting of nobles. Edwig was then taken to the meeting against his will by Dunstan. Dunstan then told Edwig to denounce the girl as a strumpet. Edwig refused. After realizing it angered the king, Dunstan fled the country. Edwig later married the girl. After his death, Edwig was succeeded by his brother Edgar. Edgar had a very peaceful reign with little to no military threats. Edgar was the first king to be crowned alongside his wife, setting up the coronation for future queens. After his coronation, he recalled Dunstan from exile to become his advisor. He died 16 years later in 975. Edwig's son Edward was not the next acknowledged heir, but he was his oldest son. There was a large argument between nobles about who should be the next king, Edward or his younger brother Aethelred. Edward was very prone to violence and evidently quite rude. After his murder 3 years later, he was considered a martyr because of his beliefs. After his brother's death, Aethelred became the next king. He was 10 when his brother died, so he was not seen as a threat by other countries. Since he was so young, he had trouble rallying the nation against invading Danes. After 35 years as king, England was invaded by the Danes. Aethelred fled to Normandy, and he was replaced by a Danish ruler, Sven. Sven was the greatest Viking ruler of his time. He ruled England for 1 year, and then died suddenly of disease. Aethelred briefly returned to power after Sweyn's death, but he had to negotiate with the nobles that previously opposed him. The nobles required him to be loyal and forgive all that was said and done against him. Aethelred died of illness 2 years later. Aethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, was the next king. He fought 5 major battles against Sven's son, Canute the Great, who was trying to conquer England. On October 18th, he lost to Canute and agreed to take Wessex and give Canute the rest of England. Canute seized control of England in 1018 when Edmund died. He avenged his father and restored Danish rule. He ruled for almost 20 years. He restored prosperity by providing protection against the Vikings, since most of them were under his command. Canute died in 1035. Canute's son Harthacnut was his legitimate heir, but could not travel to his coronation in England because his Danish kingdom was under threat of invasion. His brother, Harold Harefoot, was placed as temporary joint monarch due to the difficulty of Harthacnut's absence. When he was to be crowned, the archbishop denied him. Harold rejected Christianity in return. The country was split between him and his absent brother. Historical details are unclear as to how Harold went from being temporary regent to king of all England, but Harthacnut was still absent and unable to press his claim to the throne. Harold was generally considered to be king of England by 1035. In 1036, their stepbrother Alfred, the son of Aethelred, came to England, possibly to try and take the throne. Harold had him captured. While on a ship being brought to Harold, they blinded him, and he died shortly after from the severity of his wounds. In 1039, Harthacnut sailed to England, but delayed invasion against Harold since it was clear that Harold was sick and would soon die, which he did in 1040. Harthacnut was then crowned king. His mother demanded revenge for the death of Alfred, so Harold's body was dug up from its grave and publicly beheaded, then thrown into the sewer. It was then retrieved and thrown into the Thames, where some sailors rescued it and buried it in a churchyard. Harthacnut died in 1042 while attending a wedding. As he was toasting the health of the bride, he went into convulsions and died, presumably, from a stroke. Edward the Confessor, son of Aethelred and stepson of Canute, succeeded Harthacnut. He was canonized by Pope Alexander III and was regarded as one of the national saints of England. He died of a stroke in 1066 after entrusting the kingdom to Harold, his wife's brother. Harold Godwinson was killed at the Battle of Hastings the same year that he was crowned. The Battle of Hastings was against William of Normandy, who was trying to conquer England. Edgar the Atheling had been chosen to replace him, but he had not even been crowned when England was taken over by William's invasion. William I was crowned King of England on Christmas Day in 1066. This is when the English monarchs began taking on the number system in the fashion of the French kings. His rule was marked by the construction of castles. He died in 1087 while leading a campaign against northern France. His son, William II, succeeded him as king. He had a bad reputation with the church. He also seems to have been flamboyant. He didn't marry or have any children. He died after being struck by an arrow through the lung by one of his own men while hunting. His body was abandoned by his men at the place where he fell. It is suspected that his younger brother Henry, who was there with him, may have had something to do with the accident. The crown was supposed to go to the next brother in line, Robert. But the other brother, Henry, seized the throne and kept Robert imprisoned for the rest of his life. Henry was a harsh but effective ruler. His only legitimate son drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120. Empress Matilda was declared heir by her father, Henry I, but upon his death the throne was seized by her cousin, Stephen of Blois. An anarchy followed, and Matilda was de facto ruler for a few months in 1141, but she was never crowned and is rarely listed as a monarch of England. In 1153, Stephen came to an agreement with Matilda where he recognized Matilda's son, Henry, as the heir to his throne, since his own son had died. Henry II was an energetic and sometimes ruthless ruler. He was often in conflict with Louis VII of France. He had many children. His 15-year-old son, young Henry, was married to Margaret of France, daughter of King Louis, as an attempt to settle the tensions between England and France. He was also crowned co-ruler with his father. Later, young Henry rebelled against his father along with his brothers Richard and Geoffrey in the Great Revolt. They lost and revolted again in 1183, where young Henry died. Richard rebelled again in 1189 and overthrew Henry to become king. Henry died shortly after of a bleeding ulcer. King Richard was called the Lionheart because he was a great military leader. He was admired by his people, and by age 16 he commanded his own army and became a commander during the Third Crusade. At his coronation, he barred all women and Jews from attending. During his rule, a rumor that he had ordered all Jews to be killed started the London Massacre. Richard spent very little time in England, preferring to use his kingdom as a source of revenue to support his armies. Richard had no children, and recent historians have claimed that there was a conspiracy of silence about his homosexuality, since there was apparently records of 2 public confessions and penitences from Richard. In Richard's absence, his brother John revolted, but failed. Richard forgave him later and named him as his heir. Richard died in 1199 from a wound in his shoulder where he was shot with an arrow. King John was described as a petty, spiteful, and cruel ruler. He was often used as a character by fiction writers of the Victorian era. This is the hated King John from the Robin Hood stories. He died at age 49 in 1216 from dysentery. Louis VIII of France briefly ruled about one-half of England from 1216 to 1217, after the First Barons' War against King John. He was openly received when he marched into London and proclaimed king. Though he was not officially crowned, he later conceded that he had never been a legitimate king of England. Henry III was the first child king since Ethelred. His cousin Eleanor was the daughter of King John I's older brother, and had a better claim to the throne than Henry or his brother John. She was meant to be crowned in 1203, but John captured her and became king. However, John died shortly after, and Henry became king while keeping Eleanor in jail. Henry's son Edward I spent his early life on the Crusades. He was returning home when he learned his father died, and he immediately became king. During his reign, he subjected Wales to his rule and part of Scotland. He then committed his rule to the Ninth Crusade. This caused him to raise taxes to fund the wars. He died of dysentery, and his son Edward II took over. Edward II had what was considered to be a disastrous rule. There were several political squabbles and military defeats. When he started a conflict with France over his refusal to pay homage to the king for the territory of Gascony, he sent his wife Isabella to negotiate peace since France was her homeland. Homage was still demanded from Edward, but he sent his son to pay homage instead. His son sided with his mother and demanded that Edward's unfairly favored nephew be removed. The king refused, and Isabella invaded alongside her ally Roger Mortimer. Mortimer ruled as de facto ruler for a short time, but was not recognized by England as king. Parliament agreed that Edward II should no longer be king. His son Edward III was placed as king at the age of 14. Edward III led a coup against Mortimer and began his reign. His reign brought back success and royal authority. During his reign, the country was plagued by the Black Death. He also declared himself as King of France, and started the 100 Years' War. He never succeeded in becoming the French king, but he did succeed in taking over parts of France. He died of a stroke, and was succeeded by his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, since his own son had died. Richard II was dependent on his courtiers, which was a weakness exploited by a group of noblemen who temporarily took the rule. Richard later gained control, but was deposed from the throne by Henry IV in 1399. Henry declared him as being unworthy of the throne, and Parliament accepted it. Richard was kept in captivity and most likely died of starvation on Valentine's Day in 1400. The rule of Henry IV began the line of the House of Lancaster. While he was king, he helped his grandfather become King of France. He was also a Lord of Ireland. He supposedly had leprosy and died of an unknown disease. Henry V immediately seized the throne after his father's death. Early on, he declared war with France, continuing the 100-Year War. Later, he made a deal with the French king to become heir of France, but he suddenly died of dysentery while in France. His son, Henry VI, was described as peaceful and pious, but he was known to have outbreaks of madness. The outbreaks were so bad that his wife had to rule for him. The kingdom was overtaken by Edward IV, Duke of York, when the king was in an outbreak. The War of Roses took place between 1455 and 1485, where the throne was passed back and forth between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. The Duke of Warwick overthrew Edward and restored Henry to the throne. Edward regained the throne again in 1470 and kept it this time until he died of disease at Easter in 1483. He was succeeded by his 12-year-old son Edward V. He ruled only for 2 months. He was one of the princes in the Tower, a group of princes who disappeared after being sent to the Tower of London for their own safety. Richard III, Edward's uncle, was widely accused of murdering them, but the event remains a mystery. Richard III was next in line for the throne. He was king for 2 years, but he died at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He was the last English king to die in battle. Henry VII seized the crown in 1485 after defeating Richard in battle. He was the last king to win the crown in battle. He married Edward V's sister, securing his claim to the throne. He died of tuberculosis in 1509, and was succeeded by his son Henry VIII. Henry VIII is a famous king in movies such as The Other Boleyn Girl and the TV show The Tudors. He is known as a lustful, egotistical, harsh, and insecure king. He had 6 wives. He had married Catherine of Spain for political reasons, but had the marriage declared null and void. His second wife was Anne Boleyn, but he later declared this marriage had been the product of witchcraft and had her beheaded. The very next day, he became engaged to Jane Seymour, one of her ladies-in-waiting, and married 10 days later. She died in childbirth. His 4th marriage to Anne did not last long until the king wanted it annulled, and she did not argue. He then married her lady-in-waiting, Catherine. Catherine had an affair, and the king beheaded her. His last wife, another Catherine, was a wealthy widow. Henry separated the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church. In his later life, he became obese, and his health suffered for it. He had to be moved around with the help of mechanical invention. He died at the age of 55. His only legitimate son, Edward, became the next king. Edward was 9 when he became king. His reign had economic problems that led to riots and rebellion. He died of illness at age 15. He named his cousin Jane as his successor. Jane ruled for only 9 days. The Privy Council made her a prisoner when they changed sides and proclaimed Mary as queen. Jane was convicted of high treason and beheaded at age 16. Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII, was known as Bloody Mary for her brutal prosecution of Protestants. She married Prince Philip of Spain, and they ruled England together. Mary died 2 years later during an influenza epidemic. Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII, was next in line for the throne. Her reign is known as the Elizabethan era, famous for the arts led by playwrights such as William Shakespeare. The Queen fell in 1602 after many of her friends had died, and she fell into depression. She died in 1603 at the age of 69. The Scottish king, James VI, succeeded the English throne as James I in the Union of Crowns. He adopted the title King of Great Britain, but the 2 parliaments remained separated. James was obsessed with witch hunts, and tortured many women accused of being witches. In 1625, James fell ill, suffered a stroke, and finally died of dysentery. His son, Charles I, became King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. His reign had many religious conflicts. He began the English Civil War, where he fought the English and Scottish parliaments in an attempt to overthrow their authority. He failed and was tried for treason and beheaded at age 48. After his execution, there was no reigning monarch from 1649 until the restoration of Charles II in 1660. During this time, Oliver Cromwell and Richard Cromwell served as Lords Protector during a period known as the Protectorate. A political crisis after the death of Cromwell in 1658 caused the monarchy to be restored with Charles II as king. During his reign, there was a health crisis known as the Great Plague of London. The plague spread rapidly until the Great Fire of London occurred the following year, ending the plague but consuming over 13,000 houses and 87 churches. The fire started in a bakehouse in Pudding Lane. Charles died of a sudden seizure in 1685 at the age of 54. He was succeeded by his brother James II. James was Catholic. There were great religious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants during this time, causing riots and rebellions. A group of Protestant nobles asked Prince William of Orange to come and invade England with his army. James fled to France, and Parliament denounced him for abusing his powers and offered the crown to Protestant Mary II, who married Prince William of Orange. Mary II and her husband William III ruled England together until Mary died of smallpox. William III then became sole ruler until he died in 1702 from pneumonia. His sister-in-law Anne then became queen. Queen Anne was the last of the English monarchs because in 1707, under the Act of Union, England and Scotland were united as a single sovereign state, the Kingdom of Great Britain. All the monarchs after Queen Anne are considered British monarchs instead of just English monarchs. There have been 11 British monarchs after Queen Anne. The current queen is Elizabeth II.